The first thing my sister did when she saw me in the courthouse was laugh at my uniform. The second was to tell a local reporter that I had stolen our dead father's aircraft records. The third was to point at the ribbons on my chest and say the army had taught me how to counterfeit anything I wanted. Marla had always preferred a complete performance. She did not believe in wasting a hallway. Her husband Dean stood beside her with one hand in his coat pocket and the other resting on a leather case that did not belong to him. It had belonged to our father. I knew the pale scratch near the handle because I had put it there when I was 12 and tried to use the case as a sled. Dean saw me looking at it and smiled. "Still collecting costumes, Sam," he said. I was 55 years old. I had served more than 3 decades in Army aviation. I was a Chief Warrant Officer 5, a maintenance test pilot, and an accident investigator. That afternoon, I was scheduled to stand inside a National Guard hangar 20 miles away and retire in front of the people I had worked beside for most of my adult life. The court had moved our hearing to the same morning. That was why I wore the service uniform. Not for sympathy, not for the judge. I wore it because the Army had owned most of that day before my family claimed the rest. Marla knew that. She had received the invitation to the retirement ceremony and thrown it away. Owen, her son, told me later. At the time, all I knew was that my sister was laughing, Dean was holding our father's case, and 3 men from the grain cooperative were watching as if the county had scheduled free entertainment. I did not answer them. I checked the clock above the security desk. It was 8:27 in the morning. Before noon, the notary whose seal appeared on the deed would swear he had been 600 miles away on the day he supposedly watched our father sign it. A bank recording would explain why Marla needed the land before the end of that month. A red maintenance binder my family had accused me of stealing would appear in court in the hands of the one person they had counted on to stay silent. And before the judge left the bench, a federal aviation inspector and a county investigator would be waiting in the hallway. None of that was the part that frightened Marla most. The part that frightened her was that the judge recognized my name. Before I tell you why, think about the person in your family who is always described as absent because he does not live nearby. Then ask yourself a harder question. Is distance the same thing as neglect? Tell me what you think, because that question sat at the center of everything that happened next. The bailiff opened the courtroom doors. Marla straightened her jacket. Dean lifted the leather case. Their attorney, Calvin Ross, motioned for them to go in first, as if order of entry might decide ownership of a runway. My lawyer, Teresa Bell, came up beside me carrying one canvas bag and a yellow pad. She was 63, silver-haired, and built like a church deacon who had learned to cross-examine people for recreation. She looked at Marla, then at me. "You all right?" she asked. I told her I had flown test aircraft with warning lights that looked less ambitious than my sister. Teresa gave me the smallest possible smile. "Good," she said. "Keep that voice. Leave the rest to sequence." That was how Teresa thought. Other lawyers talked about arguments. She talked about sequence. What happened first? What happened next? Who knew what and when? In aviation, sequence is often the difference between an accident and an explanation. In court, I was about to learn, it serves much the same purpose. We entered and took our seats at opposite tables. The gallery filled behind us with people from Mason Ridge who had known my family for years. Some had bought crop spraying from our father. Some had worked summers at the airfield. Some had come because small towns can smell a private disaster before the coffee is poured. The judge entered at 8:35. Her name was Judith Klein. She was a district judge in her late 60s with short gray hair and a narrow face that did not invite improvisation. She sat down, opened the file, and began with the ordinary matters. Names for the record, appearances of counsel, the nature of the petition. Her voice was level and plain. Then she reached the page with my military biography attached to Marla's counterclaim. Judge Klein stopped reading. She looked at the page again. Then she looked across the room at me. The pause lasted only a few seconds. But a few seconds can be a long time when everyone is waiting for the same person to speak. Her eyes moved from my face to the aviation badge above my ribbons, then back to my face. I saw recognition arrive. Not warmth, not favor, recognition. Marla saw it too. The first clean line of confidence disappeared from my sister's expression. Judge Klein closed the file. Chief Rourke, she said, were you the investigating officer in the Keene Rotor case? I answered that I was. She held my gaze for one moment longer. Is Mrs. Keene still running the scholarship in Salina? She asked. I said she was, and that the program had sent 3 young mechanics to school the previous fall. The judge nodded once. Then she turned to both lawyers. I am placing something on the record before we proceed, she said. Many years ago, before I took the bench, I represented the widow of an Army pilot whose death was examined in an investigation led by Chief Rourke. My contact with him was professional, limited to that matter, and ended when the matter closed. I have had no social or personal relationship with him. Counsel may request a recess to discuss whether either party wishes to file a motion concerning my participation. Calvin Ross looked at Marla. Marla whispered to him with a sharp little movement of her mouth. Dean leaned in from the other side. They had come expecting to accuse the judge of bias if they lost. They had not expected her to name the issue before they could use it. Ross stood and said his clients did not object. Teresa said the same. Judge Klein looked directly at Marla and Dean. You understand that declining now means you may not save this issue as a spare tire for later, she said. Marla said she understood. She did not. My sister believed the judge had just admitted knowing me. What the judge had actually done was close a door, lock it, and leave the key on the record where everyone could see it. Then Judge Klein opened the file again and asked Teresa to begin. To understand why my sister thought she could take an airfield and talk the rest of us into calling it loyalty, you have to understand our father. Frank Rourke came home from Vietnam with damaged hearing, a toolbox full of Army-issue wrenches, and a belief that any machine would tell you what was wrong if you stopped blaming it long enough to listen. He had been a helicopter crew chief. He could hear a bearing going bad through engine noise that made everyone else cover their ears. In 1978, he bought 160 acres outside Mason Ridge, Kansas. Most of it was hard wheat ground. One strip ran flat enough that he graded it, planted white markers at both ends, and called it a runway before anyone else was willing to use the word. He started with one battered spray plane, one fuel tank, and a hangar made from corrugated steel that sounded like a snare drum in hail. By the time Marla and I were grown, Prairie Sky Agricultural Aviation had 4 aircraft, 7 seasonal pilots, and contracts that reached across 3 counties. The airfield was never fancy. The pilots drank coffee from foam cups. The waiting room had a calendar from a seed dealer and a couch that had survived 3 presidents. But the runway was kept smooth, the maintenance books were kept clean, and my father never sent an aircraft into the air because a customer was in a hurry. He had one saying that appeared on the hangar wall in black paint. A machine does not care who your father is. He meant that physics had no interest in family pride. As a boy, I thought it was only about engines. I learned later it was useful almost everywhere. I left Mason Ridge at 19. I enlisted, learned helicopters, became a warrant officer, and spent the next 36 years moving between flight lines, schools, deployments, accident boards, and commands that treated a weekend at home as a pleasant theory. Marla stayed. That fact became the opening sentence in every family judgment that followed. Marla stayed, so Marla understood the business. Marla stayed, so Marla knew what Dad needed. Marla stayed, so every Christmas she received the first slice of pie, and every disagreement ended with someone reminding me that I had chosen the Army. The truth was less neat. Marla did work hard. She handled scheduling, billing, insurance renewals, and customer calls. She knew every farmer who paid late and every pilot who needed to be reminded about paperwork. She could sell a nervous customer on a new spray schedule before he finished explaining what worried him. I never denied any of that. She also had a habit of treating proximity as ownership. If she was the one in the room, then the room belonged to her. If she answered the telephone, the decision became hers. If our father hesitated, she filled the silence until his hesitation sounded like agreement. My part in the business happened from farther away. I reviewed maintenance proposals when Dad emailed them. I found surplus runway lights through an Army contact who had moved into airport management. I paid for a new fuel pump when the old one failed during a bad season. I flew home on leave to help rebuild a hangar door after a windstorm. When a pilot clipped a fence and bent a wingtip, I spent 2 nights going through photographs and records so Dad would not accept a cheap repair that looked good and failed later. None of that showed from Main Street. What showed was Marla's car outside the office. Our father did not openly favor either of us when we were young. He was too practical for speeches and too tired for ceremony. But after our mother died, the balance changed. Marla lived 10 minutes away. She brought casseroles. She took him to the VFW breakfast. She knew which pharmacy had his prescription ready. I called from places where the sun came up at the wrong hour. I sent money. I used leave in pieces so small they looked like accounting errors. I came home for medical appointments and left before anyone at church knew I had arrived. Marla turned that difference into a story. Sam visits when the Army permits it. I am the one who is really here. At first, I let it go, because part of it was true. She was there more often. A person can be unfair and still possess one true sentence. The trouble began when Dad expanded the business after a run of good years. Marla convinced him to buy 2 turbine aircraft. They could cover more acres and carry larger loads. The numbers looked strong on paper. The loans did not look small anywhere. The purchase price, upgrades, and insurance left Prairie Sky owing a little more than $1,800,000. Dad put the aircraft and business equipment up as collateral. He refused to pledge the land. The land is the runway, he told Marla. The runway is not a poker chip. I heard him say it during a family meeting 3 summers before he died. I had flown in from Alabama and sat at the old kitchen table with my uniform shirt hanging over a chair because the air conditioner had quit again. Marla had a folder full of projections. Dean had a legal pad covered with figures. Dad had his coffee and the red maintenance binder he carried everywhere. Marla said the bank wanted more security. Dad said the bank could want a pony. Dean explained that the larger aircraft would double revenue. Dad asked whether they planned to spray twice as much Kansas into existence. That was Frank Rourke. He could be stubborn enough to make a fence post seem negotiable, but he was rarely vague. He agreed to let Marla run daily operations. He agreed that she would inherit the company because I had a military pension and no desire to manage crop spraying. He did not agree to give her the land. His will reflected that choice. Prairie Sky, meaning the operating company, would go to Marla. The 160 acres, including the runway, hangars, and farmhouse, would be divided equally between us. She would have the first option to buy my half at a value set by an independent appraisal. Until then, the company could lease the runway under terms already written into the estate plan. It was not the plan Marla wanted, but it was a workable one. She would own the business. I would own half the ground. The aircraft could keep flying. Dad's intention was plain enough that even our old hound could have understood it, and he had spent 11 years surprised by screen doors. Then the business weakened. A dry season reduced spraying. One of the turbine aircraft developed a compressor problem. A major customer moved its work to a larger operator in Wichita. Insurance premiums rose after a hard landing by a seasonal pilot. By the following spring, Prairie Sky was short on cash and facing a large payment at the end of June. Marla did not tell me any of that. She told Dad. He was 79 by then. His hearing was worse. His hands shook when he was tired, but his mind was still his own. He called me one evening and asked what happened when an aircraft engine had a part installed without complete trace paperwork. I asked which aircraft. He said it was only a question. I told him it depended on the part, the records, and the circumstances, but no honest mechanic guessed about origin when safety was involved. Federal rules require maintenance entries to identify the work, the date, and the person who approved the aircraft to return to service. Certain continuing records travel with the aircraft. A missing history can ground an airplane, ruin a sale, and make an insurer suddenly remember every comma in the policy. Dad was quiet. Then he said, "Your sister thinks paper is slower than weather." I asked him what that meant. He changed the subject. 2 weeks later, he had a stroke in the office beside the hangar. Marla found him. Dean called the ambulance. I was in Germany briefing an accident board when Owen sent me a message that said, "Only Grandpa is alive, but come now." I landed in Kansas the next evening. Dad could understand us. He could nod. He could say a few words when he was rested. His right hand did not work well, and frustration sat on him like extra weight. Marla controlled the visitors because she was listed as his healthcare agent. She told the nurses I upset him. She told me the doctors had ordered quiet, then held business meetings in his room with Dean and the company bookkeeper. I did not fight in the hallway. I asked the charge nurse for the actual visitor policy. I arranged a time to sit with Dad alone. He watched me close the door. Then he used his left hand to point at my shirt pocket. I always carried a grease pencil there. It was a habit from flight lines, useful for marking a windshield, a map cover, or a part tag. Dad wanted it. I gave him the pencil and a hospital meal card. His writing wandered. The letters were large and uneven, but I could read them. No land loan. Then he tapped the card twice and pointed toward the window in the direction of the airfield. I told him I understood. He died 6 weeks later after a second stroke. At the funeral, Marla stood beside the casket and accepted condolences as if she were receiving customers. Dean wore Dad's old Army crew chief pin on his lapel. Owen stood apart near the back of the church, staring at the floor. 3 days after we buried our father, Marla called me to the airfield office. She placed a recorded warranty deed on the desk. According to that deed, Dad had transferred every acre, every hangar, the farmhouse, and the runway to a new company called Prairie Sky Holdings. Marla owned that company. The signature was dated 12 days after his first stroke. The notarial acknowledgement said Frank Rourke had personally appeared before Leon Maddox at the hospital on May 18th. Marla folded her arms. Dad changed his mind, she said. He finally understood who stayed. I looked at the signature. Then I looked at the notary seal. I did not know yet how the fraud had been done, but I knew my father had not held a pen in his right hand on May 18th, and I knew Leon Maddox had been somewhere else. Leon Maddox was not hard to place because I had seen his name on a flight safety message the week Dad died. Leon was a warrant officer in the Kansas Army National Guard. He also held a state notary commission and did mobile appointments around Mason Ridge when he was not in uniform. On May 18th, his aviation unit was supporting a wildfire mission in New Mexico. I had read the daily report because one of their helicopters had made a precautionary landing after a chip light. That is the kind of detail an aviation investigator remembers. Tail number, time, crew, location. Some people remember birthdays. I remember aircraft that came home with metal on a magnetic plug. I asked Marla for the original deed. She said the county had it. I told her the county had an electronic image and a recorded copy. I wanted the signed original. Dean stepped between us and said I was no longer entitled to company files. I reminded him land records were not company files until someone proved the company owned the land. Marla leaned close enough that I could smell the peppermint she used when she was angry. "You have been gone 36 years, she said. "Do not come home and teach us how Dad lived." I could have told her about the hospital card in my wallet. I could have told her about Dad asking me about trace paperwork. I could have told her that being nearby had not given her the right to rewrite his hand. I did not. I asked one more time for the original. She refused one more time. Then I left. The first call I made was to Leon. He did not answer. An hour later, he sent a message saying he was still out of state and would call when he returned. The next morning, before he could do that, I received an email from Calvin Ross, Marla's attorney. It warned me not to contact witnesses, employees, customers, lenders, or members of my sister's family. It also demanded the immediate return of the red maintenance binder and several original aircraft logbooks that Ross claimed I had removed from the hangar during Dad's hospitalization. That accusation was not random. The red binder was where Dad kept duplicate summaries for every aircraft. Not the full legal records, but a running index of engine changes, inspections, major repairs, recurring directives, and the location of supporting documents. Dad built it because computers had disappointed him in 1994 and he had refused to forgive them. I had seen the binder at the kitchen table 3 summers earlier. I had seen it in his hospital room once, on a chair beneath Marla's coat. I had not touched it after his stroke. If it was missing, Marla and Dean had a problem far larger than a family argument. I called Teresa Bell. I knew Teresa from a property dispute involving an access road near an Army training site. She had spent years in the state attorney general's office before opening a small practice in Salina. She did not advertise on billboards. She did not promise justice in large red letters. She returned calls, read footnotes, and disliked adjectives in sworn statements. Those qualities seemed more useful. I drove to her office with the recorded deed, Dad's will, the hospital card, and a copy of Leon's mission orders that had been attached to the guard's safety report. Teresa read everything without interrupting. Then she put the hospital card under a clear sleeve and asked whether anyone else had seen Dad write it. I said no. She said we would treat it as context, not a magic key. That was the first reason I trusted her. A weaker lawyer would have fallen in love with the card. Teresa understood that a shaky note from a dying man might move a room without carrying the legal weight people imagined. She pointed to the deed. Under Kansas law, a real estate transfer has to be acknowledged before an authorized officer. For an ordinary acknowledgement, the person signing is supposed to appear before the notary, and the notary must identify that person and confirm the signature. A seal copied onto paper is not a substitute for a human being in the room. Then she tapped Leon's orders. If these are authentic, she said, the acknowledgement is false. But false acknowledgement does not tell us who created it or why. We need both. The why arrived faster than the who. Teresa filed a petition challenging the deed and asked the court to place notice of the dispute in the county land records. That notice stopped Marla from quietly presenting clear title to a lender while the case was pending. 2 days later, Prairie Skies Bank moved a scheduled closing off its calendar. By the end of that week, Marla filed her counterclaim. She accused me of exploiting Dad after his stroke. She said I had used military authority and technical language to frighten him into signing a memorandum that preserved my half of the land. She claimed I had removed maintenance records so Prairie Sky could not complete an appraisal. She asked the court to declare me unfit to serve as co-executor of the estate. Buried near the end was a request for damages based on business losses caused by my interference with the refinance. That was the first time she admitted there was a refinance. Teresa circled the paragraph. There is our pressure gauge, she said. Discovery opened slowly, then all at once. We requested bank correspondence, company financial statements, drafts of the deed, computer records, visitor logs from the hospital, and every version of the maintenance index. Ross objected to nearly everything. He called our requests burdensome. He called them invasive. He called the business records irrelevant to title. Teresa replied that a person who says she needed a deed to prevent financial harm had already made the finances relevant. The judge agreed. What came back was incomplete, but incomplete records have a shape. Prairie Sky had missed 2 principal payments. The company owed $430,000 on an engine overhaul line. The Wichita lender had offered a bridge refinance of $1,900,000, but only if Prairie Sky Holdings could give the bank a first claim on the land and runway before June 30th. Dad had refused the same arrangement twice while he was healthy. A week after his stroke, the new holding company was formed. 12 days later, the deed was supposedly signed. 4 days after that, Marla emailed the lender saying title was secured. The sequence did not prove forgery by itself. It did explain panic. Then we found the first crack in Dean's story. He had sworn in an affidavit that he drove Leon to the hospital on May 18th and waited outside while Dad signed. Hospital entry records showed Dean's badge had not been used that day. Parking camera footage showed his truck entering the Prairie Sky hangar lot shortly before noon and leaving after 4. Ross said someone else could have driven the truck. Teresa asked why that someone had also used Dean's electronic key at the maintenance office. Ross stopped answering by email after that. Leon returned from New Mexico and came to Teresa's office with his attorney. He looked exhausted and angry. He confirmed that he had not been in Kansas on May 18th. He had not seen Dad after the stroke. He had not notarized the deed. The seal image on the document looked like his, but the registration number beneath it came from an older design he had replaced months earlier. Leon kept a personal journal even though he did not rely on memory alone. His last legitimate notarization for Prairie Sky had been an equipment lease the previous November. That document had been scanned into the office computer. Someone had access to a clean image of his old seal. Leon agreed to testify, but he asked us not to announce his cooperation. He still served with people who did business with Prairie Sky. He wanted the court to hear it once, under oath, not 6 times at the cafe. I respected that. While Teresa followed the deed, I followed the aircraft records. I was careful. I did not enter company property. I did not call employees covered by counsel's instruction. I worked with copies produced in Discovery and public aircraft records. The turbine aircraft with the compressor problem was registered as November 846 Prairie. Its engine record showed a major hot section repair completed in February. The return to service entry carried Dean's signature and certificate number. The attached parts list named a compressor wheel by serial number. That serial number belonged to a different model. At first, I thought it was a typing error. Then I found the same number in an insurance submission, a lender appraisal, and a parts invoice from a broker in Oklahoma. 3 separate documents repeated the same impossible number. Errors repeat when people copy them. Fraud repeats when people need the copies to agree. I told Teresa the aircraft might have been approved with a part that could not be traced to the engine. She asked what that meant in ordinary language. I said it meant the airplane might be safe, or it might not, but the records could not prove either answer. It also meant a careful lender would reduce the aircraft value, an insurer might reserve coverage, and the federal inspector could ground it until the history was established. Teresa sat back. So the missing binder does 2 jobs, she said. It hurts the refinance, and blaming you explains why they cannot produce it. That was the central shape of Marla's plan. She did not only want my half of the land, she needed clean title to rescue a failing company. And she needed me to look dishonest before anyone listened when I pointed at the aircraft records. In her version, I was not a brother asking why our father had signed away a runway. I was a bitter soldier who had stolen the proof. There was only one person inside Prairie Sky who might know where the proof actually was: Owen. My nephew had grown up in the hangar. He was 24 and training for his mechanic certificate. He could remove a cowling faster than Dean and apologize to an engine when he dropped a washer. He also took instant photographs of every major job because Dad had taught him that hands forget and pictures do not. I had not heard from Owen since the funeral. Then, 10 days before trial, an envelope arrived at Teresa's office with no return address. Inside was a single instant photograph. It showed Dean at the office scanner. Beside his hand lay Leon's old equipment lease, open to the page with the notary seal. On the back, in Owen's handwriting, were 5 words. The red binder is safe. The photograph was powerful and almost useless. Without Owen, Teresa could not establish who took it, when it was taken, or whether the image had been altered. She sent a process server to his apartment. He was gone. His employer said he had taken personal leave. His telephone went straight to voicemail. Teresa placed the photograph in a sealed evidence sleeve and said, "We would not build the case around a witness who had not decided whether he could stand in daylight. We already had enough to challenge the deed." What we did not yet have was a clean explanation for the missing binder or direct proof that Marla knew how the seal had been copied. That was the uncertainty I carried into the courtroom while my sister laughed at my uniform. After Judge Klein made her prior contact disclosure, Calvin Ross gave his opening statement. He was polished, careful, and expensive in the way only a man billing by the 10th of an hour can afford to be. He described Marla as the devoted child who had preserved a local business through drought, illness, and grief. He described me as a career officer who returned at the end of our father's life and immediately began demanding records. He said, The deed reflected Dad's final decision to protect the child who had remained and the business that carried his name. Then he moved to the missing maintenance records. Ross said, "My training gave me the knowledge to remove, alter, or conceal aviation documents." He suggested that I had created the hospital card after Dad's death. He did not say I forged it. He said there were questions. Lawyers sometimes use questions the way crop dusters use mist. The point is not to strike one place. The point is to cover the field. Marla watched the gallery while he spoke. She knew the local faces. She knew which pauses would make them nod. Teresa's opening took less than 10 minutes. She said this was not a contest between a child who stayed and a child who served elsewhere. It was a case about a deed acknowledged by a notary who was in another state, recorded during a financial emergency, and used to support a loan our father had rejected while healthy. Then she said the sentence I remembered all day. "Affection can be argued," she told the court. "Sequence can be proven." Ross called the first witness. Nora Phelps lived across from Dad for 20 years. She testified that Marla brought groceries, checked the mail, and drove him to appointments. All true. Then she said she rarely saw me. Teresa asked whether Nora could see the highway from her kitchen. Nora said no. Teresa asked whether she could see the back entrance to the farmhouse. No. Whether she knew who paid for Dad's home oxygen unit. No. Whether Dad discussed his estate plan with her. No. Teresa thanked her and sat down. The next witness was Prairie Sky's bookkeeper, Gail Henson. Gail said Dad had become concerned that I wanted to sell the runway to developers. She claimed she heard him say that Marla should receive everything because I had my Army retirement. Teresa asked when he said it. Gail said early spring, before or after the first missed loan payment. Gail looked at Ross. The judge told her to answer the question, not the lawyer. Gail said after Teresa asked whether Gail prepared the financial package for the Wichita lender, yes. Whether that package required proof that Prairie Sky Holdings owned the land, yes. Whether she had emailed Marla saying the company would fail the bank test without the deed. Ross objected, but the email had already been produced. The judge allowed the question. Gail admitted she had. By lunch, Ross had called 4 witnesses. Each offered some version of the same truth. Marla was physically present. I was often away. Then each tried to stretch that truth into ownership. A former pilot said I once told him the business was not my future. I agreed with that statement. The operating company was not my future. That did not mean Dad wanted to erase my half of the ground. A church elder remembered Marla sitting beside Dad at Easter. He did not remember that I had joined the service by video from a hangar in Poland because Dad had asked me to hear the sermon with him. A local appraiser said the company and airfield would be more valuable under one owner. Teresa asked whether market convenience could change a valid will. The appraiser said no. Through all of it, Judge Klein took notes and showed almost nothing. She was harder on Teresa than I expected. When Teresa asked Gail to interpret a bank covenant, the judge stopped her and said a bookkeeper could describe what she did, not give legal meaning to a lender's contract. When Teresa referred to the notary seal as stolen before Leon testified, the judge corrected her. The evidence at that point showed disputed use, not theft. That was when I understood the effect of the Keene case on Judge Klein. It had not made her gentle with us. It had made her exact Keene case. The Keene case happened 17 years earlier, after an Army medical evacuation helicopter went down during a training flight in Georgia. Captain Aaron Keene was the pilot in command. He and 2 crew members died. The first theory blamed him. A weather change had forced the aircraft lower. A witness reported an abrupt turn. A contractor representative suggested pilot disorientation. That explanation moved fast because it fit inside one paragraph and protected several people with larger offices. I was a junior accident investigator then. My job was to examine maintenance and component history. The main rotor system had been worked on less than 40 flight hours before the crash. One retaining assembly carried a lot number that did not match the manufacturer's production records. The contractor said the number had been copied incorrectly. The unit said the records were complete. An officer above me suggested that we note the discrepancy and keep moving because the board had a deadline. I kept moving, just not in the direction he meant. I traced shipping papers through 3 warehouses and found that a small batch of counterfeit components had entered the supply chain through a subcontractor. The part on Aaron Keene's aircraft had passed visual inspection and failed under load. The turn witnesses saw was not a confused pilot. It was a trained pilot fighting a control system that had stopped obeying him. Judith Klein was an aviation insurance lawyer then. Aaron's widow, Laura, hired her after benefits, and a private policy became tangled in the early finding of pilot error. Klein sat through my deposition. She watched the contractor's lawyers question every page of my report. She saw me refuse to change the sequence simply because the original story had already reached headquarters. The final findings cleared Aaron. The benefits were released. The contractor lost its claim that the crew had caused the loss. More important to Laura, her 2 children did not grow up reading that their father had killed his crew through carelessness. I never considered that a favor. It was the work. Years later, Laura started a scholarship for students entering aircraft maintenance. I stayed in touch because she asked me to serve on the technical review board. Judge Klein had helped create the legal foundation before she became a judge. That was why she remembered me. It was also why she refused to let memory do 1 ounce of the work that evidence was supposed to do. After lunch, Ross called Marla. My sister walked to the witness stand in a navy suit and Dad's crew chief pin fastened near her collar. Dean had worn it at the funeral. Now she wore it for court. Ross led her through years of appointments, tax filings, customer emergencies, and late nights at the office. Marla cried when she described finding Dad after the stroke. I believed those tears. People are not required to be false in every part of themselves. She had loved him. She had also decided that love entitled her to choose what his signature should say. Then Ross asked about me. Marla said I had treated the family like a temporary duty station. She said I called only when I wanted information. She said Dad feared I would sell the land to a warehouse developer after retirement. She said he signed the deed with his left hand because his right hand was weak. That detail mattered. The signature on the deed slanted and looped exactly like Dad's old right-hand signature. Teresa did not react. She wrote 1 word on her pad and turned it so I could see. Hand. Ross asked Marla whether she knew the deed had been notarized. She said Dean handled the paperwork and she trusted both him and Leon. Ross asked whether she had ever scanned Leon's seal. No. Whether she had seen Dean scan it? No. Whether she knew where the red binder was? No. Whether she had any reason to believe Owen knew. For the first time, Marla hesitated. Then she said her son had been confused since the funeral and was easily influenced by me. I had not spoken to Owen in months. Teresa rose for cross-examination. Before she asked a question, Judge Klein looked toward Ross's table. "Counsel," she said, "I have received copies and photographs throughout the morning. For the deed, the power of attorney, and the disputed maintenance entries, I will require originals or a witness who can account for their absence. This case concerns the authenticity of documents. Convenience copies will not carry the burden by themselves." Ross asked for a recess. The judge gave him 20 minutes. In the hallway, Marla grabbed Dean by the arm and pulled him toward a conference room. Ross followed. Through the glass, I saw my sister speaking fast. Dean opened Dad's leather case and moved papers from one side to the other as if the missing original might appear through discipline. Teresa sat beside me on a wooden bench. She said, "They came to court with a copy of a lie and hoped nobody would ask where the paper went." I checked the clock. It was 1:12. At 1:15, my telephone vibrated. The message came from Owen. "I am downstairs," it said. I brought the binder. Teresa went downstairs alone. She returned 10 minutes later with Owen and another lawyer from her office. My nephew looked as if he had not slept. He wore work boots, a clean white shirt, and the same canvas jacket Dad had given him when he finished mechanic school. In both hands, he carried the red binder. Marla saw him through the courtroom door. Her face changed before she could stop it. Not anger, fear. Teresa asked the judge for a short conference at the bench. Ross objected before he knew what she wanted. Judge Klein told him objections worked better after a request existed. Teresa explained that a previously unavailable witness had appeared voluntarily with records responsive to discovery. She offered to let Ross inspect the binder before any testimony. Ross said the surprise was unfair. The judge asked whether his clients had listed the same binder as missing and accused me of taking it. Ross said they had. Then its appearance cannot be unfair merely because it appeared from the wrong direction, Judge Klein said. She gave both sides 30 minutes. Owen waited in a witness room. I did not speak to him. Marla tried. The bailiff stopped her after Teresa said Owen had separate counsel for the afternoon. While Ross examined the binder, Teresa resumed Marla's cross-examination. She began with the deed. Marla repeated that Dad signed with his left hand. Teresa placed 3 documents on the display. The first was Dad's signature from a property tax form before the stroke. The second was his left-hand practice signature from occupational therapy. The third was the disputed deed. The deed matched the old right-hand signature down to a small upward hook at the end of the last name. The left-hand sample did not. Teresa asked whether Marla had seen Dad sign the deed. Marla said she had been in the room at the beginning but stepped out to take a call. That was different from her deposition, where she had said she never entered the hospital that day. Teresa read the question and answer from the transcript. Marla said she had misunderstood. Teresa asked whether Dean drove Leon to the hospital. Marla said that was what Dean told her. Whether she knew Leon was in New Mexico. No. Whether she knew the company was required to own the land before the bank closing. She said the bank preferred it. Teresa placed the loan commitment on the display and read the condition requiring exclusive title and a first claim on the airfield acreage. Was that a preference, Teresa asked, or a condition? Marla said she was not a lawyer. Teresa asked whether she had created Prairie Sky Holdings 1 week after Dad's stroke. Yes. Whether the holding company had any purpose other than receiving the land and pledging it to the bank. Marla said it was part of a long-term restructuring. Teresa showed an email from the company accountant asking why the entity had no business plan, no employees, and no account until the lender requested it. Marla said the accountant worried too much. Teresa asked whether she told the lender that Dad had signed freely. Yes. Whether she told the lender he could not use his right hand. No. Whether she told the lender the deed was being challenged by a co-heir. Not until after our petition. Whether she told the lender about the missing maintenance binder. Marla looked at Ross. Judge Klein reminded her again that witnesses answer questions with words, not with counsel's face. Marla said no. Then Teresa asked the question that opened the first real break. Why did your counterclaim say Chief Rourke stole the binder before you reported the binder missing to your insurer? Marla's mouth opened, but no answer came. Teresa showed the dates. The counterclaim had been drafted on a Monday. The insurance notice was filed the following Thursday. Yet the notice said the loss had only been discovered Wednesday night. Marla said Dean handled insurance. Teresa asked how she accused me 3 days before the company claimed to know anything was gone. Marla said she did not remember. There are moments in court when a witness loses more than an answer. She loses control of the order in which her own story happened. Marla had reached that moment. Teresa sat down. Ross called for Dean, but Judge Klein said Teresa could present her witnesses first because Ross had requested the recess and the day was moving. Leon Maddox took the stand in his guard service uniform. He had come directly from duty at the state aviation facility. The sight of 2 uniforms in the room made Marla's earlier joke seem smaller than it had in the hallway. Leon identified his commission, his old seal, his replacement seal, and his mission orders. He explained that on May 18th, he was at a temporary flight site outside Santa Fe. His duty log placed him there from before sunrise until late evening. Fuel records and a meal receipt carried the same location. Teresa asked whether he had witnessed Frank Rourke sign the deed. No. Whether Frank appeared before him by video. No. Whether Leon authorized anyone to apply his seal later. No. Then Leon explained the rule in language nobody in the gallery needed a law degree to understand. A notary does not decorate a signature, he said. The signer appears before you. You identify that person. You confirm the act. If the person is not there, there is no acknowledgement. There is only an image of a seal. Teresa showed him the disputed deed and the equipment lease from the previous November. Leon pointed to a tiny break in the outer circle of the old seal, caused by a nick in the stamp. The same break appeared on the deed. So did a faint black speck near the commission line that existed on the scanned lease, but not on any paper Leon had stamped by hand. Ross suggested someone in the county recorder's office could have created the artifact during scanning. Leon said that did not explain why the artifact matched the office copy of the old lease before either document reached the county. The next witness was Evelyn Hart, the rehabilitation nurse who had cared for Dad. She was 66 and had the calm posture of a woman who had spent 40 years waiting for families to stop speaking over patients. Evelyn testified that Dad could understand conversation on May 18th. He could communicate by nodding, short words, and writing with his left hand. He could not produce his old right-hand signature. She also testified that no notary appointment appeared on the visitor schedule, no private meeting had been authorized, and Dad was in physical therapy during the hour listed in Dean's affidavit. Ross asked whether visitors sometimes entered without being noticed. Evelyn said family members sometimes slipped past a desk. A notary completing a land transfer with an impaired patient was not supposed to. Teresa asked whether Dad ever discussed the land. Ross objected. The judge allowed a limited answer concerning Dad's state of mind, not the legal ownership of the property. Evelyn said Dad became agitated when Marla mentioned using the runway for a loan. He repeated the words, "no mortgage," and pointed toward the window. I felt the hospital meal card inside my breast pocket. I had carried it into court even though Teresa had warned me not to treat it like a flag. The third witness was Philip Grady, the commercial lender from Wichita. He brought the bank file under subpoena. He was not eager to be there. Bankers prefer disputes after the money has been paid. Grady explained the refinance. Prairie Sky needed $1,900,000 to replace overdue aircraft debt, pay the engine vendor, and create working capital for the next season. The bank would not close without first position on the land. The aircraft alone did not support the requested amount because one had incomplete engine documentation and reduced appraisal value. There it was. The maintenance problem and the land transfer were not separate mistakes. They were parts of the same rescue attempt. Teresa asked when Grady first learned Dad had suffered a stroke after our lawsuit. He said, when he first learned the notary disputed the deed. After our lawsuit. When he first learned the red binder was missing. After our lawsuit. Then Teresa asked about recorded calls. Grady confirmed that the bank's commercial line played a recording notice at the start of every call. The relevant call had been produced in discovery with its system record and timestamp. Ross objected to context and foundation. Judge Klein heard the details, reviewed the transcript, and admitted the portion concerning the loan condition and title. Marla's voice came through the courtroom speaker. She sounded tired, impatient, and entirely certain nobody outside the bank would ever hear her. Grady asked whether both heirs had approved the land transfer. Marla answered, "Sam is buried in an army review overseas. He will not see the county filing until after we close. Once the money lands, there will be nothing practical for him to stop." Grady said the bank needed lawful title, not merely practical control. Marla replied, "My father signed. Dean handled the witness. I need this finished before the end of the month." Then Grady asked about the missing engine records. Marla said, "Dean says Sam took them because he wants the aircraft values cut. He knows exactly which paper to remove." The call ended. No one moved for several seconds. I had heard Marla say cruel things in private. Hearing her use my profession as both alibi and weapon felt different. She had counted on the army keeping me away. Then she had counted on the army making me easy to blame. Judge Klein looked at Ross. "Counsel," she said, "your client represented that the deed was complete and the witness had been handled. I expect the next testimony to address who handled him and how." Dean shifted in his chair. Teresa called me. I took the oath and sat facing a room full of people who had spent the morning hearing that I came home only for land. Teresa did not begin with my medals. She began with maintenance. I explained what an aircraft record must show. Work performed, date completed, identity and certificate of the person approving return to service. I explained why certain status records remain with an aircraft and why a serial number matters. A turbine engine is not a pickup truck at an auction. A lender, insurer, buyer, pilot, and mechanic all rely on the history being what it claims to be. She showed the compressor wheel entries. I explained that the listed serial number belonged to another model. It appeared in the maintenance entry, invoice, appraisal, and insurance packet. That repetition suggested copying from one source rather than 4 independent checks. Ross asked whether I was accusing Dean of installing an unsafe part. I said I was accusing the records of failing to prove what part had been installed. Safety investigation begins where certainty ends. He asked whether I wanted Prairie Sky grounded. I said I wanted no pilot asked to bet his life on an entry nobody could support. He asked whether I had ever removed the red binder. No. Whether I knew where it had been. Not until that afternoon. Whether I had encouraged Owen to take it. No. Whether my military training made me skilled at preserving a cover story. I told him military aviation had made me skilled at noticing when one required too much maintenance. A few people in the gallery laughed. Judge Klein stopped them with a look. Teresa then moved through the years Marla had described as absence. She showed leave forms tied to Dad's surgeries, flight receipts for trips that lasted less than 2 days, bank transfers for runway lights, fuel system repairs, and home nursing, email chains in which Dad asked my advice and Marla copied my answers into company plans, video call logs from Sunday evenings, a canceled vacation I had used to inspect storm damage after Prairie Sky's insurer delayed sending an adjuster. I had not gathered those records to prove love. Teresa found them because Marla made presence an issue. The hardest item was a stack of invoices from Dad's rehabilitation. I had paid the portion insurance did not cover after Marla told me the company had no spare cash. On the same week, she formed Prairie Sky Holdings and paid its legal fee from the estate account. Marla looked down while Teresa read the dates. I did not feel vindicated. I felt embarrassed that care had been turned into exhibits. Some things become smaller when placed under fluorescent lights. Teresa asked about the hospital card. I described Dad using my grease pencil and writing no land loan. The judge admitted the card only for the fact that I received it and acted on it, not as a substitute for a deed or will. That was enough. We did not need it to carry more. When I stepped down, Judge Klein called a short break so Ross could finish examining the red binder and speak with Dean. I found Owen at the end of the hallway near a window. He looked at me but did not come closer. I told him he did not owe me an explanation before he testified. He said, I do not know if I am doing the right thing. I answered, the right thing and the painless thing are not often parked in the same hangar. He nodded and looked through the glass at the courthouse lawn. Then he said something that made the rest of the case larger than the land. Uncle Sam, Dean was going to burn the binder. Owen told me what had happened in pieces. 2 nights after the funeral, he heard Dean and Marla arguing in the maintenance office. The lender had asked for original aircraft records before closing. Dean said the red binder tied the questionable compressor wheel to a salvage broker whose paperwork would not satisfy an inspector. Marla said the binder had to disappear before the bank appraiser returned. Owen waited until they left. He took the binder from a locked cabinet using the spare key Dad had given him years earlier. He carried it to the old crop storage shed behind his apartment and wrapped it in 2 contractor bags. He did not tell anyone because he feared Dean would report him for theft and Marla would say, I had ordered it. Then he heard about their counterclaim. They had done exactly that without knowing where the binder was. The instant photograph came from Owen's habit of documenting work. Weeks before Dad's stroke, he walked into the office while Dean was scanning the old equipment lease. Owen had been testing a repaired camera and took a picture because Dean complained that young people recorded everything. At the time, Owen thought nothing of it. After the lawsuit began, he understood what the image showed. I asked why he waited. He looked toward the witness room where Marla sat behind a closed door. Because she is my mother, he said. There was no answer that improved that fact. When court resumed, Teresa called Owen Voss. He took the oath with both hands visible on the rail. Marla watched him as if she could pull him back into childhood by force of attention. Teresa asked about the binder. Owen identified it by Dad's handwriting, the cracked lower corner, and an oil stain shaped like the state of Oklahoma. He explained where Dad kept it and why. He admitted taking it after the funeral. He admitted hiding it. He said no one, including me, knew where it was until he sent the photograph to Teresa. Ross asked the judge to strike the binder because Owen had removed it without authority. Judge Klein said wrongful possession could affect credibility and other consequences, but it did not make the physical object imaginary. She would hear the foundation and decide what weight to give it. Teresa opened the binder. The first pages were ordinary. Inspection dates, engine times, lists of recurring work. Then she reached the section for November 846 Prairie. Dad had written every significant engine event in pencil. The compressor wheel entry had been added in blue ink in Dean's handwriting. Beside the serial number was a small red check mark. Owen explained the check mark. Dean used red to mark paperwork he intended to replace with a cleaner copy before final filing. Teresa showed the court 3 early examples. In each, a red check marked a temporary invoice later replaced by a final certified document. For the compressor wheel, no replacement document existed. Instead, tucked into the binder pocket was the original broker invoice. It described the part as removed from a damaged engine and sold for evaluation only. No approval tag. No trace chain. No representation that it could be installed and returned to service. Dean had submitted a different invoice to the insurer and lender. That version removed the warning language and described the component as serviceable. Owen said he was present when Dean installed the wheel. He asked where the approval paperwork was. Dean told him it would arrive later. When Owen raised the question again, Dean said Prairie Sky would be out of business before paperwork mattered unless the aircraft returned to work. Teresa asked whether the part had caused an accident. Owen said no. Whether he knew it was unsafe. He said no. Then why did he hide the binder? Because Dad taught me that not knowing is not permission, Owen said. That sentence landed harder than any accusation. Before I tell you what Owen produced next, remember what it cost him to sit there. If you have ever seen someone choose truth while every person they love is asking for silence, share this story with them. Courage does not always arrive with a flag. Sometimes it arrives carrying a stained binder and shaking hands. Teresa asked about the photograph of Dean at the scanner. Owen authenticated it. He named the room, the date, the camera, and the equipment lease beneath Dean's hand. He also produced the rest of the instant photographs from the same cartridge. One showed the office clock. One showed the weather through the window. One showed Dad sitting at his desk earlier that morning. Together, they established that the image was not created after the dispute. Then Owen reached into the binder pocket and removed a small digital voice recorder. Dad had used it after the stroke when writing tired him. Evelyn Hart had shown him how to press one large button. Owen found the recorder in the binder when he hit it. He listened to it once, then stopped because hearing Dad's voice felt like opening a door without knocking. Teresa had already copied the file, preserved the device, and disclosed it to Ross during the recess. Evelyn had identified her own voice at the start. A technical witness had confirmed the file carried no sign of editing. Judge Klein admitted one short recording concerning Dad's intent and the pressure he felt, with a warning that it did not replace the formal estate documents already in evidence. The speaker clicked. Evelyn's voice said, "Frank, the red light means it is recording." Dad breathed heavily. Then his voice came through. Slow but clear. "Marla wants the runway for the bank. I told her no before I got sick. I tell her no now. Company to Marla. Ground split with Sam. Dean says paper is ready. I did not sign land away." There was a pause. We heard fabric move. Then Dad added, "Owen, if you find this, do not fix a lie for family. A bad repair is still bad when your name is on the hanger." The recording ended. Owen lowered his head. Marla made one sound. It was not quite a sob and not quite a word. I stared at the red binder because looking at my sister felt impossible. Dad had left no grand speech. He had left instructions in the language he knew. Runway, paper, repair, name. Ross cross-examined Owen carefully at first. He established that Owen took the binder without permission, disliked Dean's shortcuts, and had recently argued with his mother about pay. Then he asked whether I had promised Owen a job after retirement. Owen said no. Whether Teresa had promised immunity. No. Whether he wanted his parents to lose the business. Owen looked at Marla. I wanted them to stop before the business cost someone more than money, he said. Ross had no useful place to go after that. He called Dean. Dean walked to the stand, carrying himself like a man who still believed confidence could outrun documentation. He said he scanned the equipment lease for routine filing. He denied copying the seal. He said the disputed invoice was a preliminary version and the missing approval tag had been misplaced. He said Dad signed the deed during a private meeting and Leon must have forgotten. Teresa asked whether guard orders, flight logs, fuel records, and Leon's testimony were all products of forgetfulness. Dean said Leon could have notarized remotely. Leon had testified no remote session occurred. The deed itself described an in-person appearance. Teresa asked why Dean's affidavit said he drove Leon to the hospital. Dean said Ross drafted it too broadly. Ross rose abruptly, and his chair struck the table. The judge told Dean that blaming his own lawyer for a sworn statement was a serious choice and gave him a moment to consider it. Dean changed his answer. He said he had been confused about the date. Teresa showed the Prairie Sky office access log. Dean's key opened the office at 11:42 on May 18th. His key opened it again at 7:14 that evening. The deed file was created on the office computer between those times. The county upload occurred from the same internet account the next morning. Then she showed the document examination. The signature on the deed was not merely similar to Dad's old signature. It aligned with a scanned signature from a 2-year-old fuel easement at more than a dozen turning points. Natural signatures vary. These did not. The deed signature had been placed from the older image and adjusted in size. Dean denied doing it. Teresa asked who else had access to the scanner. The easement, Leon's old lease, the lender package, Dad's leather case, and the office computer. Dean named Marla, Gail, and Owen. Owen's key record showed no office entry during the relevant period. Gail had been in Topeka at a bookkeeping conference. Marla's phone placed her at the hospital, where she had told the lender Dad was reviewing papers. That left Dean. Teresa did not call him a forger. She did not need to. She placed the steps in order and sat down. Judge Klein recessed for 45 minutes to review the exhibits and findings. Nobody in the gallery left. Even the men from the grain cooperative stayed in their seats without speaking. I sat beside Teresa and watched Marla approach Owen near the courtroom doors. She said, "You destroyed us." Owen answered, "I stopped helping." Marla lifted her hand as if she might slap him. Dean caught her wrist. "For once, I do not think he did it to protect Owen. I think he saw the bailiff watching." The judge returned shortly after 5. My retirement ceremony had begun without me. Judge Klein read her findings slowly. She found that the deed was not signed or acknowledged by Frank Rourke. The signature had been reproduced from an earlier document. The notary seal had been copied from an old lease. Leon Maddox was outside Kansas on the stated date. Hospital and office records contradicted Dean's account. The transaction arose during a documented financial emergency and against Dad's repeated refusal to pledge the land. She found Marla's testimony unreliable, where it changed between deposition and trial. She found the recorded bank call demonstrated that Marla intended to complete the refinance before I learned of the filing. She found the accusation that I stole the binder was made before Prairie Sky claimed to discover it missing. She found that Owen's testimony was supported by the physical binder, photographs, access records, and voice recording. The deed was declared void. Title returned to Dad's estate for distribution under the valid will. Prairie Sky, the operating company, would still pass to Marla, subject to its debts and any action by regulators or lenders. The land would be divided equally, with the lease option handled under the estate plan. Marla was removed as personal representative and ordered to account for estate money used to create the holding company and defend the false deed. Her counterclaims against me were dismissed. Judge Klein ordered the originals preserved. She directed the clerk to send the disputed notarial and signature records to the county attorney. She also ordered that the relevant maintenance exhibits remain available under seal for lawful request by federal aviation authorities. She made clear that a civil ruling was not a criminal conviction and that other agencies would make their own decisions. That distinction mattered. Truth does not become stronger when you claim more than it proves. Marla stood before the judge finished. This was decided when you recognized him, she said. You were never going to believe us over a decorated officer. Ross reached for her arm, but she pulled away. Judge Klein looked at my sister without raising her voice. I disclosed my prior professional contact at the start, she said. You consulted counsel and declined to object. More important, my memory is not an exhibit. Your recorded call is. The false acknowledgement is. The copied signature is. The hospital schedule, office access log, lender condition, and original binder are. I did not choose between a sister and a soldier. I compared your account with the record you created. Marla said the business would collapse. The judge answered. A court cannot repair a business by validating a fraudulent deed. Dean muttered that everyone made paperwork mistakes. Judge Klein looked at the red binder. A mistake does not normally require a false witness, a copied seal, a copied signature, a missing record, and an accusation prepared before the loss is discovered, she said. That was the last sentence anyone needed. The bailiff called the next matter closed. As people stood, two men entered the hallway. One wore the plain badge of the county investigator. The other carried a federal aviation identification case. They did not arrest anyone. They asked lawyers to remain and arranged custody of copied records. Marla watched them through the open door. The fear I had seen when Owen carried in the binder was no longer hidden. I did not feel victorious. I felt the way I had felt after difficult accident boards, when the cause was finally known and nothing about knowing could bring back what had already been damaged. By the time I reached the National Guard hangar, the chairs had been folded. A retirement banner still hung crooked above the maintenance bay. Someone had saved a piece of sheet cake under a plastic lid. My commander, Colonel Anita Wells, stood beside a small group of soldiers who had refused to leave. I apologized for missing my own ceremony. She said, Chief, after 36 years, you have earned the right to arrive late once. They did not make speeches. They handed me the folded flag, the retirement certificate, and a wooden rotor blade signed by people from 4 assignments. We drank bad coffee from paper cups. That suited me better than a ballroom would have. Owen came in near the end and stood by the hangar door. He had left the courthouse without Marla and Dean. He carried Dad's leather case. The county investigator had released it after photographing the contents because the case itself belonged to the estate. Owen handed it to me. I told him I remembered putting the scratch in the handle. He said Grandpa remembered too. He used to say you could damage anything if you gave a farm boy enough downhill slope. That was the first time either of us laughed that day. The months afterward were quieter than the trial and harder in less visible ways. The bank withdrew the refinance. Prairie Sky could not make the overdue aircraft payment. The federal inspector grounded November 846 Prairie until its engine history and installed components could be established. A second aircraft was restricted after other record problems surfaced. Dean's mechanic privileges became the subject of formal action. He eventually surrendered his inspection authority while the case was pending. The county charged him with offenses related to the false deed and copied acknowledgement. Marla was charged later with participating in the filing and making false statements during the loan process. Their lawyers reached separate agreements the following year. I will not pretend I followed every hearing. By then, I had learned that knowing each consequence is another way of staying tied to the people who caused it. The civil accounting showed that Marla had used more than $80,000 from Dad's estate for company expenses, legal work on Prairie Sky Holdings, and the attempted refinance. She was ordered to repay it. The business sold both turbine aircraft and most of its equipment. Smaller debts were paid, larger ones took negotiation. Marla kept the corporate shell. Dad had left her, but there was little operation left inside it. We did not speak for nearly a year. I did not call to explain that I had never wanted the company. I had said it for decades, and she had used the statement as evidence that I deserved nothing. Repeating it would not make her hear a different meaning. Owen moved into a rented room over a hardware store in Salina. He found work with an independent repair shop and cooperated with the investigations. Some people in Mason Ridge called him disloyal. Others called him brave. He disliked both words. He told me he had done one necessary thing too late. I understood that description. The estate took time to settle. An independent appraisal valued the land below the number Marla had promised the bank and above the number either of us could ignore. Her creditors needed cash. Under Dad's will, I had the first chance to buy her half. I used part of my retirement savings and a loan that did not require anyone to copy a signature. The day the purchase closed, I drove to the airfield alone. The runway had weeds along the edges. The windsock was torn. The office smelled of dust, hydraulic fluid, and coffee that had probably become a protected species. Dad's black sign still hung on the hangar wall. A machine does not care who your father is. I stood beneath it and considered selling everything to a farmer. That would have been simple. Simplicity has real value after a family trial. Then I opened Dad's leather case. Teresa had gone through the legal papers, but neither of us had noticed a narrow zipper behind the accordion divider. Inside was an envelope addressed in Dad's hand to Owen and me. The note was dated 6 months before his stroke. Sam, it began. If the big airplanes work, Marla will have earned her chance. If they do not let pride make a crater. Owen has good hands. Help him get the certificates the right way. Keep one strip of ground where a veteran can learn a trade without being treated like charity. Under the note was a savings certificate for $12,000. Dad had set it aside for Owen's mechanic testing, tools, and tuition. At the bottom, he had added one line. You two listen better than the rest of us. That was the warmest thing Frank Rourke ever wrote. It was also close to an apology, though I do not know which of us he intended it for. I called Owen. We spent the next year turning the old main hangar into a training shop for veterans, moving from military aviation into civilian maintenance. The process was not ceremonial. It was permits, insurance, donated benches, grant applications, and more arguments about electrical wiring than any family should survive. Former service members can use documented military experience towards civilian mechanic qualifications, but the experience still has to be organized, verified, and presented properly. We built the program around that gap. Laura Keene helped connect us with the scholarship she had started after Aaron's crash. She did not know Judge Klein had recognized me until the case was over and public. When I told her, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Aaron's name got its truth because you followed a part number. Your father's land got its truth for the same reason. I told her part numbers were less troublesome than families. She said, I had clearly never met a government stock system. The first class began with 6 veterans. One had maintained transport helicopters. One had worked on Navy patrol aircraft. One had fueled jets but wanted to learn engines. 2 were older than the instructors at the community college. The youngest had left the service after an injury and still walked with a cane. Owen taught tool control and record entries. I taught inspection habits and how to distrust a clean answer that arrived before the evidence. We kept Dad's red binder in a glass cabinet, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that records protect people only when someone protects the records. On the morning we dedicated the shop, the Kansas wind came across the wheat hard enough to lift hats. The old windsock had been replaced. The runway markers were freshly painted. A small sign beside the hangar read Frank Rourke, Veterans Aviation Workshop. No politicians came. That was a planning success. Colonel Wells attended in civilian clothes. Leon Maddox flew in with a guard crew during a training stop. Evelyn Hart brought a pan of cinnamon rolls and ordered everyone to eat before speaking. Laura Keene stood near the front with the first 3 scholarship mechanics her program had helped years earlier. Marla did not come, but just before we opened the doors, a delivery driver handed Owen a small padded envelope. There was no return address. Inside was Dad's crew chief pin, the one Dean had worn at the funeral and Marla had worn in court. There was also a note in Marla's handwriting. This belongs where the work is honest. No apology, no request. No promise that our family would be put back the way it had been. I did not need to turn one sentence into more than it was. Owen held the pin for a while. Then he fastened it above the entrance to the tool room. beneath Dad's black sign. That afternoon, the veteran with the cane completed the first supervised engine run on a training aircraft. Owen stood beside him with a checklist. Laura watched from the open hangar. The new windsocks stretched straight in the prairie wind. I stood at the edge of the runway, holding the grease pencil Dad had used in the hospital. I had carried it through the trial, retirement, closing, and every month of construction. For the first time, I used it for something other than remembering. On the shop board, I wrote the date of our first class. Then I drew one clean line beneath it. A year earlier, that runway had been collateral for a lie. Now it was a place where people who had spent their lives keeping military aircraft in the air could build a second life with their own names on the work. The truth had not restored my family. It had done something smaller and more useful. It had kept the ground from being used for the wrong purpose long enough for us to find the right one.